The morning Anna Keene rode into Harlan County with a leather satchel full of banknotes and a jaw set like flint. Nobody in the town of Dust Creek gave her more than a passing glance, and that was exactly the kind of mistake that would cost them all dearly before the season turned. It was the spring of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle had just survived one of its cruelest winters on record. The land was only now beginning to remember itself, pushing pale green shoots up through cracked red earth, the sky a washed-out blue that promised heat before long. Anna had ridden from Amarillo on a roan mare named Cressida, and the two of them were trail-worn and hungry and possessed of the particular quiet dignity that belongs to women who have learned to rely entirely on themselves. Anna was 26 years old, dark-haired and brown-eyed, with capable hands roughened from years of practical labor, and a mind that had been educated well beyond what most people in this part of Texas would have expected or approved of. Her father, a land surveyor named Thomas Keene, had died the previous autumn, leaving her his survey maps, his instruments, and a small inheritance that she had stretched carefully over the winter months while she studied the land records filed with the county office in Amarillo. What she had found in those records had brought her here. The Thatcher Ranch, some 4,000 acres of prime grazing land along the East Fork of the Canadian River, was in arrears on its property taxes for 2 consecutive years. The county had not yet moved to seize it, but the clock was running. Anna had done her calculations carefully. With her father's inheritance and what she could negotiate with the small cattle operation she had been quietly building since his death, she had exactly enough capital to purchase half of the Thatcher land, provided the owner was willing, and to use that land as collateral against a loan that would allow her to expand her herd and make the whole enterprise profitable within 3 years. It was a sound plan. Anna had not arrived at it emotionally. She had arrived at it through careful study of soil composition maps, water rights records, and the price of beef cattle in Dodge City. She was not sentimental about land. She was practical. She needed it to survive, and she intended to get it. What she had not calculated was Emmett Thatcher. She found the ranch after 2 hours of riding along a rutted track that wound between stands of mesquite and cottonwood, the Canadian River glittering to the north like a seam of hammered silver. The main house came into view around a long bend, and Anna pulled Cressida up short for a moment just to look at it. It was a handsome structure, hewn log and rough-cut limestone, with a deep porch running the full front length and a stone chimney at each end. The yard was swept clean, the fence lines were straight. The barn, large and red-painted, sat 60 yards to the west, and from it came the sound of a hammer striking iron in a steady, unhurried rhythm. Anna dismounted, tied Cressida to the fence post nearest the porch steps, and walked toward the barn. She found him at the forge. He was a tall man, lean in the way that comes from hard outdoor work rather than scarcity, with dark hair shot through with early threads of silver at the temples and a jaw dark with 3 days of growth. He was working a length of iron into what appeared to be a hinge, turning it in the coals, and then hammering it on the anvil with practiced strokes. His shirt was rolled to the elbows and his hands were gloved against the heat. He did not look up immediately, and Anna stood in the wide barn doorway and watched him work for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. When he finally set the hammer down and looked up, his eyes were a deep gray-green, the color of river water in shadow, and they were sharp with intelligence and something else she could not immediately name. "Miss," he said. His voice was low and measured, the kind of voice that did not seem to need much volume to carry. "Mr. Thatcher," Anna said, "my name is Anna Keene. I have come from Amarillo on a matter of business." He pulled off his gloves and tucked them into his belt, studying her with those gray-green eyes. He was perhaps 31 or 32, she estimated. There was nothing hostile in his expression, but there was a watchful quality to it, the look of a man who had learned to wait before speaking. "Business," he repeated. "That's so. Come up to the house then and tell me about it." He led her to the porch, where a scarred pine table held a blue enamel coffee pot and 2 tin cups, as though he had been expecting company or had simply not yet cleared his breakfast things. He poured without asking whether she wanted any, which she found she did not mind, and they sat across from each other in ladderback chairs with the spring morning spread out before them, mockingbirds carrying on in the mesquite and a warm wind coming up from the south. Anna opened her satchel and placed her survey maps on the table, smoothing them flat with her palms. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, laying out what she knew about the tax arrears, what she was proposing to pay, and precisely which parcel of land she intended to purchase. She watched his face as she talked. He did not interrupt. He did not look insulted or embarrassed, though she had essentially informed him that she knew his finances were in distress. He simply listened, and when she finished, he picked up the edge of the survey map and studied it for a long moment. "You have surveyed this yourself?" he asked. "My father was Thomas Keene, county surveyor for the northern Panhandle for 20 years. I worked alongside him from the time I was 12. I do not need anyone to check my measurements." A faint expression crossed his face. Not a smile exactly, but something adjacent to it. "I knew Tom Keene," he said. "Good man. I am sorry for your loss." She had not expected that, and it caught her somewhere in the chest in a way she had not prepared for. She kept her expression even. "Thank you." He set the map down and looked out at the land for a moment, his coffee cup held loosely in both hands. "You know why the taxes are in arrears," he said. It was not quite a question. "I have some ideas," she said carefully. "My foreman stole from me," Emmett said flatly. "Man named Grover Sills, worked here 11 years. I trusted him with the accounts when my brother died 2 winters ago and left me short-handed. He took enough over 18 months to put me in the position you have clearly researched very carefully." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a kind of tired honesty that Anna respected. "I am sorry about your brother," she said. "James was a good man." He said it simply, and then he was quiet for a moment, and Anna did not fill the silence because it seemed like the right kind of silence to leave alone. "What I am offering is fair market value for the eastern parcel," she said, after the quiet had run its natural course. "You would retain the western half with the river frontage, which is the more valuable portion for cattle. The money I pay you clears your tax arrears with enough left over to hire properly and restock whatever you have lost." He looked at her directly then. "And what do you intend to do with 4 sections of Panhandle grass, Miss Keene? It is not small ranch, running 4 sections by yourself. I have 12 head of longhorn currently boarded at a ranch outside Amarillo. I intend to move them here and build up from there. I have spoken with 2 experienced cowboys who are willing to work for me. I know this land. I know this grass. I know water rights along the Canadian better than most because my father surveyed every inch of it." She paused. "I am not asking for your opinion of my capabilities, Mr. Thatcher. I am asking if you are interested in the offer." He looked at her for a long moment, and there it was again, that thing in his eyes she had not been able to name before. She understood it now. It was respect, reluctant perhaps, but genuine. "I need a few days to think on it," he said. "I have time," Anna said. "I intend to take a room in Dust Creek. Dust Creek's only accommodation is Nell Hadley's boarding house, and it is not particularly comfortable. I have slept in worse." He almost smiled at that. "I expect you have, Miss Keene." She finished her coffee, folded her maps, returned them to her satchel, and stood. She was aware of him watching her as she walked back to Cressida, and she was equally aware that she was not annoyed by it. She swung up into the saddle and turned the roan south toward the town road. "I will come back Thursday," she called without turning around. "Thursday it is," he said from the porch. Nell Hadley's boarding house was exactly as uncomfortable as Emmett Thatcher had suggested. The mattress had seen too many years of use. The wallpaper was peeling at every corner, and the other 2 boarders, a traveling dry goods salesman named Pryor and an elderly man of uncertain occupation named Whitfield, were both inclined to long conversation at dinner about subjects that did not interest Anna in the least. But the food was plentiful and the water hot enough for a decent bath, And Anna had her father's map spread across the floor of her room and a week's worth of thinking to do, so she was content enough. She spent the next 2 days riding the land she intended to buy, checking her father's old surveys against the current lay of the ground, noting where the grass was thick and where it had been overgrazed, tracing the seasonal creek beds that fed off the Canadian and assessing which would hold water into high summer. She was absorbed in this work in the way she was always absorbed in work she believed in, and she did not think about Emmett Thatcher any more than was practical. This was not entirely true. She thought about his voice, which was measured and steady in a way that suggested a man who had earned his calm the hard way. She thought about the way he had said James was a good man, with that particular gentleness that men of that type carried for grief, quiet and inward and never fully set down. She thought about his eyes, gray-green and watchful, and the way they had held that respect she had not earned from a man so quickly in a long time. She was a practical woman. She acknowledged these thoughts, noted them and set them aside. On Tuesday afternoon, she was riding along the northern boundary of the eastern parcel when she came upon a fence line that had been recently cut. 3 sections of wire lay curled and useless in the grass, and beyond the break, hoofprints of a good dozen cattle led south onto what was clearly Thatcher land. She followed the tracks for half a mile before she picked up rider tracks as well, 2 horses, and from the depth and spacing of the prints, they had been moving the cattle deliberately and unhurriedly, which meant they were not wild cattle, and whoever had moved them knew they had time. She rode back to the cut fence and studied it more carefully. The wire had been cut with proper cutters, not broken by pressure. This was intentional. Someone was running cattle onto Thatcher grass and using the cut fence to make it look like strays crossing from the eastern parcel. It took her the better part of the afternoon to find out why. She rode into Dust Creek and went to the county land office, a single room tacked onto the side of the courthouse, staffed by a heavy-set man named Dorsey who smelled of pipe tobacco and looked faintly annoyed to be consulted. "Parcels east of the Thatcher boundary," she said, placing her finger on the records book. "Who owns them?" Dorsey looked at the entry with the air of a man who knew perfectly well and was deciding whether to say. "Fellow name of Callaway," he said finally. "Reed Callaway. Runs the biggest spread west of the county line." Anna had heard the name in Amarillo. Reed Callaway was one of those men the Panhandle had produced in considerable number since the cattle drives began, a man whose wealth was real but whose methods of acquiring it did not always reward close examination. He had been involved in a land dispute 3 years prior that had ended badly for the smaller landowner, and there were whispers about his relationship with certain county officials that Anna's father had once mentioned in his private journals. She understood the situation now with sudden clarity. Callaway wanted the eastern parcel of Thatcher land. He wanted the whole ranch, most likely, but the eastern parcel was the doorway because it was the parcel that was hardest for Emmett to manage short-handed. If he could drive Emmett's cattle off that grass by claiming they were Callaway strays, creating a range dispute, and simultaneously pressure the county on the tax arrears that Grover Sills had created, he could make Emmett's position untenable. The cut fence was theater. It would give Callaway grounds to file a complaint about encroachment and add pressure to an already pressured man. Anna folded her notes, thanked Dorsey with a politeness she did not feel, and rode directly to the Thatcher ranch. She found Emmett in the south pasture with one of his 2 remaining cowboys, a weathered man named Pete Briggs who had the kind of face that suggested he had been everywhere at least once and had not been surprised by any of it. They were inspecting a group of cattle that did not, Anna could see immediately, carry the Thatcher brand. Emmett looked up when she rode in, and something in her expression must have told him she had news, because he dismissed Pete with a nod and walked toward her. "I found your cut fence," she said without preamble. He was very still for a moment. "Which one?" "Northern boundary of your eastern parcel, 3 sections down. Whoever did it ran cattle through." "I tracked them south about half a mile." She looked at the strange cattle in his pasture. "Are those them?" "Some of them." His voice was level, but there was a tightness in his jaw she had not seen before. "Callaway's man was here this morning. Said these cattle are his strays and suggested that my line riders had been careless about the fence and that I owed him for whatever grazing his cattle had taken on my land." He paused. "While they were on my land because someone cut my fence." "He is going to file a complaint," Anna said. "I spoke with Dorsey at the land office. Callaway has been acquiring land all along this corridor. He wants yours. He has been patient about it, but with your tax situation he sees an opening." Emmett looked at the cattle and then at the middle distance, that steady quiet of his working. "I know what he is doing," he said. "I have known for 6 months. What I have not had is the capital to fight it on 2 fronts at once." Anna looked at him. He looked at her. The spring wind moved through the grass between them. "Then perhaps," she said carefully, "my offer is worth considering, not only for the money, but for what a second landowner on that eastern parcel would mean. Callaway cannot manufacture a fence dispute with 2 sets of title holders without implicating himself considerably more directly." Emmett was quiet for a long moment. A meadowlark was singing somewhere nearby, 3 clear notes and then silence and then 3 notes again. "You are not just a businesswoman, Miss Keene," he said slowly. "I am exactly that," she said. "I just happen to think several steps ahead." For the first time he smiled properly, and it was a warm and genuine thing that changed his whole face, and Anna Keene, who was extremely practical, felt something shift in her chest that was entirely impractical, and noted it with the same careful attention she gave to soil composition data. He invited her to stay for supper. She accepted. They ate at the long pine table in the kitchen, a meal that Emmett cooked himself since his cook had left at the end of winter, beans and cornbread and salt pork, and it was plain food but good, and they talked across the table with an ease that surprised them both. He told her about growing up on this land, how his father had broken the first ground when Emmett was 6 years old, how he and James had learned to ride before they could properly read, how the winter of 1872 had killed half their cattle and their father had refused to sell, and had rebuilt from nothing over 3 years. He spoke about his brother with a quiet love that was honest and unashamed, and Anna liked him the more for it. She told him about her father, about the years of riding survey lines through country that most people had not yet named, about learning to read topography the way other children learn to read letters, about the particular loneliness and freedom of that kind of life. She had not talked about her father to anyone since his death, and she was surprised to find that it did not hurt as much as she had expected. It felt instead like honoring something. By the time the coffee was finished, the spring dark had settled fully outside and the coyotes had started their distant chorus, and Emmett Thatcher had agreed in principle to consider her offer. She rode back to Dusk Creek under a sky so full of stars it seemed almost generous, and she allowed herself, just for those 2 hours of riding, to think about things that were not practical at all. The next morning she woke to noise. She pulled on her clothes and went to the window of her boarding house room and saw, in the street below, a man on a gray horse speaking very loudly to Dorsey from the land office, who had come out in his shirt sleeves looking alarmed. The man on the horse was broad-shouldered and barrel-chested with a thick reddish mustache and the kind of fine hat that costs more than most cowboys earned in a month. She did not need anyone to tell her who he was. Reed Callaway had come to Dusk Creek. Anna dressed fully, pinned her hair, collected her satchel, and went downstairs. She did not approach the scene in the street. She went instead to the courthouse and asked the clerk, a nervous young woman named Bertha, whether any complaints had been filed that morning regarding cattle encroachment. Bertha confirmed that a formal complaint had been lodged at first light against the Thatcher Ranch by a representative of the Callaway operation for damages relating to fence destruction and unauthorized grazing. Anna asked to see the complaint. Bertha hesitated. Anna placed $2 on the counter with a pleasant expression. Bertha produced the complaint. It was precisely as she had expected and somewhat worse. The complaint was detailed and legally careful, suggesting it had been prepared in advance, and it included a surveyor's note that placed the cut fence inside Thatcher territory rather than on the Callaway side, which was a falsification that Anna could disprove with her own survey notes, but which would require time and a sympathetic magistrate to do so. The whole document had the smell of Grover Sills about it, that same careful manipulation from a hand that had been close to the Thatcher operation long enough to know its weaknesses. She rode to the ranch. Emmett was in the yard when she arrived, and he already knew. Pete Briggs had ridden in at dawn with the news. The three of them stood in the morning sun, and Anna spread her survey notes across the porch table and showed Emmett and Pete exactly where the false notation was, and why it could not be accurate based on the water drainage pattern she had mapped. The surveyor's note in Callaway's complaint claimed the fence line ran 6 yards east of its actual position. If it had, the seasonal creek that Anna had noted in her survey would have to flow uphill to reach the Canadian. It could not. Physics was uncomplicated on this point. That will hold in front of an honest magistrate, Emmett said, looking at her notation. The question, Anna said, is whether Harlan County has won. Pete Briggs snorted. Judge Alderman in Tascosa is straight as a rail, but Callaway has had his hand in the pocket of the county judge here for years. Then we take it to Tascosa, Anna said. Emmett looked at her steadily. You said we. She met his eyes. I said we. My survey is part of this evidence. I have a stake in seeing the land records of this county kept accurate. She paused. And I am beginning to believe my stake in this particular piece of land may be somewhat greater than I originally assessed. He held her gaze for a beat longer than was strictly necessary. Thursday, he said finally. You said you would come back Thursday for my answer on the offer. So I did. I will have an answer for you Thursday. She nodded and began gathering her notes. I will take a copy of Callaway's complaint and my survey evidence to Tascosa tomorrow. The circuit court sits there every other week. If we can get before Alderman before Callaway files any further paperwork locally, we can establish the accurate survey on record. I will ride with you, Emmett said. You do not need to. I am capable of presenting this myself. I know you are. His voice was quiet and direct. But this is my land and I will stand up for it myself. You should not have to carry that alone. Anna looked at him for a moment. There was a warmth in what he had just said that went beyond courtesy, and they both knew it, and neither of them acknowledged it directly, and somehow that made it more significant rather than less. All right, she said. We ride at first light. The ride to Tascosa took the better part of a day, a long traverse across open Panhandle country that was simultaneously monotonous and magnificent, the great flat sky above, and the infinite grass below, and the two of them riding side by side with their horses' hooves making a steady rhythm in the dust of the track. They talked for much of it, and they did not talk about business. He asked her about her plans beyond the ranch, whether she intended to stay in the Panhandle long term, or whether the land purchase was part of a larger scheme that might eventually take her elsewhere. She told him honestly that she had not thought much beyond the next 3 years, that she was building something because building was what she knew how to do, and because her father had left her with the tools and the knowledge, and she did not intend to waste either. He told her about a book he had been reading, a collection of essays by a man named George Perkins Marsh about the relationship between land and the people who worked it, about the way poor stewardship destroyed what good stewardship could sustain over generations. He had clearly thought about these ideas carefully, and his observations about them were specific and interesting, and Anna found herself turning to look at him as he spoke in the way she did when someone was saying something genuinely worth hearing. You are not what I expected, she said, somewhere around the midday halt when they stopped to water the horses at a limestone tank that caught runoff from a low ridge. He looked at her over the back of his horse, an amused light in those gray-green eyes. What did you expect? A defensive man, she said honestly. I came to your ranch and told you I knew your finances were in trouble and laid out a business proposal across your breakfast table. Most men in your position would have been hostile about it. I considered it. he admitted. For about 30 seconds, the amusement softened into something more direct. But you came prepared, and you knew what you were talking about, and you did not treat me like someone who needed to be managed. That is harder to find than most people think. Anna looked at the water in the limestone tank, pale blue and still. My father used to say that the worst kind of condescension is the kind that calls itself kindness. Emmett was quiet for a moment. He sounds like he was worth knowing. He was. She said it without the tightness she usually felt and realized with some surprise that the grief had shifted since she had talked about him 2 nights ago at Emmett's table. Not gone, but changed in quality, the way a wound changes when it has finally been properly cleaned. He would have liked you, she added, before she had quite decided to say it. Emmett looked at her and did not say anything, and the quiet between them was the kind that has weight and warmth in equal measure. They reached Tascosa in the late afternoon, a busy cattle town settlement on the south bank of the Canadian that was considerably more active than Dusk Creek, with its broad main street and the constant traffic of trail crews and merchants, and the various enterprises that served both. Judge Alderman's clerk informed them that the circuit session would begin the following morning, and that a new filing could be accepted until sunset that day. Anna filed her survey evidence and a formal response to the Callaway complaint with 20 minutes to spare. The clerk, a precise man named Fontaine who treated all paperwork with equal solemnity regardless of who presented it, accepted her documents without comment and gave her a receipt. They took rooms at the Exchange Hotel, which was a significant improvement over Nell Hadley's establishment, with plastered walls and actual furniture of some quality. They had supper in the hotel dining room, and it was a different kind of meal than the one they had shared at his kitchen table, served by a waiter and accompanied by other diners and the general business of a working cattle town hotel, and yet somehow more intimate rather than less, because they were both aware of something that had been growing between them all day and had not yet been given a name. Emmett ordered a bottle of wine, which surprised Anna, and when she raised an eyebrow he said mildly that he was not entirely a frontier primitive, and she laughed, a genuine laugh that she felt in her whole chest, and he watched her laugh with an expression that was unguarded and entirely present. They talked about everything and nothing, about cattle prices and trail routes and the railroad coming through, and what it would mean for ranching across the Panhandle, about books they had both read and opinions they had formed about them, about the specific quality of Panhandle light in different seasons, and how it changed the color of everything. The candle on the table burned low and still they were talking, and when Anna finally looked up and noticed that the dining room was nearly empty, she felt the slight shock of time having passed without her tracking it, which was not a thing that happened to her often. "I should sleep," she said. "The hearing is at 9. Emmett walked her to the foot of the staircase, and they stood there for a moment, and the hotel lamp was warm between them and the street was quiet outside, and there was a specific gravity to the moment that Anna was aware of in a way that made her breath a little unsteady. "Miss Keene," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "Anna," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came of its own accord. Something crossed his face that was private and unhurried and entirely serious. "Anna," he said, and her name in his voice was its own kind of thing, careful and warm. "For whatever it is worth, I am glad you rode out to my ranch and told me the things you told me." She looked at him for a moment. "So am I," she said. "Emmett." She went upstairs. She lay awake for some time in the dark of the hotel room, listening to the sounds of Tascosa at night, horses and distant voices and the wind along the river, and she thought about gray-green eyes and the specific sound of her own name spoken by a particular voice, and she recognized with perfect clarity that she was in a great deal of trouble of the most interesting kind. The hearing before Judge Alderman went well. The judge was a thin, precise man with silver spectacles and a manner of listening that suggested he was actually doing it rather than waiting for his turn to speak. which distinguished him immediately from most of the public officials Anna had encountered. He examined Anna's survey evidence with genuine interest, asked several intelligent questions about methodology and notation, and reviewed the Callaway complaint with an expression of increasing skepticism. Reed Callaway was represented by a lawyer from Amarillo named Hardcastle, who was competent and polished and clearly experienced at presenting weak cases in the best possible light. He argued that Anna's survey, conducted at her own initiative and in obvious anticipation of a land purchase, was biased in its conclusions. Anna replied from the gallery that the drainage patterns of the Canadian River tributary system were not subject to commercial bias, and that she would be happy to demonstrate with a bucket of water and a copy of her father's original 1863 survey, which was filed with the county of the territory, and which showed the identical fence line position she had recorded. Judge Alderman allowed himself a very brief expression of amusement. He ruled that the Callaway complaint was based on a surveying error and was dismissed without prejudice, which meant it could not be refiled without new evidence. He further ordered the fence to be restored at the expense of whichever party had cut it, a finding that required no great deductive effort to interpret. They walked out of the courthouse into the Tascosa afternoon sun, and Emmett Thatcher, man of measured silences and careful words, turned to Anna Keene and took both her hands in his and looked at her with those gray-green eyes wide open and said, "I do not know what I would have done if you had not ridden out to my ranch." Anna looked down at his hands holding hers. His hands were warm and rough and steady. She looked up at his face. "You would have managed," she said. "You are not the kind of man who doesn't manage." "Not as well," he said, and with considerably less pleasure in the managing. She felt color rise to her face, which was not something she was accustomed to, and she was aware that they were standing on a public street in Tascosa, and that this probably argued for releasing her hands, and she did not release his, and he did not release hers, and they stood there for a moment in the afternoon sun with the Canadian River shining nearby and the whole enormous sky above them. They rode home the next morning. The ride back was different from the ride out. There was less careful talk and more comfortable silence, the kind that does not need to be filled, and occasionally their horses came close enough together that their stirrups nearly touched and neither of them adjusted the gap. The Panhandle rolled out around them in all its spare beauty, the light long and golden in the late afternoon, the grass moving in patterns that looked almost like water from a distance, and Anna thought that she had ridden across a great deal of country in her life and never found any of it as beautiful as this particular piece of it felt right now. They arrived at the Thatcher Ranch in the early evening. Pete Briggs came out of the barn at the sound of hooves, and his weathered face told them the news before he spoke it. "Callaway's men came through this afternoon," Pete said. "Didn't do anything, just rode the boundary line slow and deliberate, 4 of them looking the place over." Emmett was very still. "How many head are we missing?" "None. I moved everything to the south pasture after you left." "But Emmett," Pete looked uncomfortable. "Callaway himself came to the house, spoke with old Whitfield." Emmett frowned. "Whitfield, Henry Whitfield. He is your neighbor to the west," Anna said quietly. She had seen the name in the land records. "He is 81 years old and not entirely himself anymore," Emmett said. "He has a granddaughter in Abilene, but she has not been out here in 2 years. He looked at Pete. "What did Callaway want with him?" "Seems Callaway has been pressing him to sell for months. Henry told me afterward, shaking like a leaf. Callaway told him that once the Thatcher land was sorted, Henry would have no neighbors worth having, and his best option was to sell before the market turned." Pete paused. He was trying to scare the old man. Anna felt something cold and decided settle in her. "He is consolidating," she said. "He wants the whole corridor, Whitfield's land, your land, the eastern parcel. He wants the Canadian River frontage from the county line to the East Fork." Emmett looked at the horizon, where the sun was going down in extravagant orange and rose. His jaw was set. "He is not going to get it." "No," Anna agreed. "He is not." Thursday arrived the way Emmett had said it would, and Anna rode out to the ranch in the morning with her satchel and her maps and her carefully prepared figures. She tied Cressida to the fence and went up the porch steps, and Emmett was already there, 2 cups of coffee on the table and something in his expression she could not entirely read. "Sit down," he said. He sounded different. Not nervous exactly, but as though he had been thinking very hard for several days and had arrived at an edge. She sat. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Outside, a pair of mockingbirds were conducting an argument in the mesquite with passionate intensity. Emmett sat down across from her and was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee, and then he looked up at her directly in that way he had that was entirely without evasion. "I have been thinking," he said, "about your offer. I expected you had. I have thought about the land and the money and the tax situation and what it would mean for the eastern parcel to have a second title holder." He paused. "I have thought about all of that very carefully. And," she said, "and I do not want to sell you half the ranch, Anna." She held very still. Something tightened in her chest. Emmett Thatcher set his coffee cup down slowly and clasped his hands on the table and looked at her with those gray-green eyes utterly calm and serious and open. "I would rather give you all of it," he said. The silence that followed was one of the most interesting silences Anna had ever sat inside. The mockingbirds had gone quiet. The wind had paused. Even the coffee steam seemed to hold itself. "That is not a business offer," she said finally. "No," he said, "it is not. Emmett," her voice was very careful. "I know what I am saying," he said quietly. "I am not a reckless man, and I am not speaking from sentiment about the legal document. I mean it in the other sense." He met her eyes. "I am saying that I do not want a business partner on this land. I want a life partner. I am saying that I have spent 4 days thinking about it, and I cannot think about this land without thinking about you standing on it, and I cannot think about any future here that does not have you in it." He paused, and the steadiness in his voice was the kind that comes from absolute conviction. "I know we have known each other less than 2 weeks. I know that is not a long time by any conventional measure. But I also know what I know." Anna looked at him for a long moment. The tightness in her chest had resolved into something else, something that felt like standing at the edge of a high place with a good wind under it, somewhere between terrifying and entirely right. "You are asking me to marry you," she said. "I am," he said simply. "Over a business proposal," she said. "I am afraid so," a very faint smile. "It is perhaps not the conventional approach." "No," she agreed. "It is not." She looked down at her hands on the coffee cup and then back up at his face. "Emmett, I came here with a practical plan and a head full of surveys and an inheritance that I have been stretching for 6 months and a total of 12 longhorn cattle. I came here to buy land. I did not come here for anything else." "I know," he said. "Neither of us came here for this." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the spring morning was moving on without them. Bees at work in the new flowering mesquite and the Canadian River going about its business to the north. "I am not a conventional woman," she said. "I will never be the kind of wife who stays in the house. I will work this land as an equal partner in every respect. I will have opinions about everything and I will voice them. I will manage accounts and ride fence lines and make decisions that I believe to be correct, and I will not apologize for any of that." "Good," Emmett said. The single word was entirely sincere. She looked at him, at the direct honesty of his face, at the warmth beneath the steadiness of his expression, and she thought about his voice saying her name in the lamplight of the Tascosa Hotel, and his hands holding hers outside the courthouse, and every conversation they had had across every table and open stretch of country in the past 2 weeks, and she thought about her father who had taught her to read land and to trust her own judgment about what she found there. "Yes," she said. He looked at her as though the word had done something to the quality of the air around him, something structural and permanent. "Yes," he repeated. "Yes," she said again with complete certainty. He reached across the pine table and took her hand, the same way he had taken it in Tascosa, warm and steady and sure, and this time she turned her hand in his and held it, and they sat there in the spring morning with the mockingbirds starting up again in the mesquite, and everything very new and very solid at once. There was still Callaway to deal with. They both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. The hearing in Tascosa had only addressed the immediate complaint. The larger campaign, the steady pressure, the boundary riding, the pressure on old Henry Whitfield, continued. Emmett had ridden over to see Henry the day before and found him shaken and confused, not fully clear on what Callaway had said to him or what he had agreed to, and the discovery had worried Emmett more than the fence cutting. "Henry has no one to advocate for him," Emmett told Anna. They were riding the northern boundary together, checking the restored fence line. "His granddaughter in Abilene does not know the situation." "Then someone needs to write to her," Anna said. "I did not know how to make it urgent enough without frightening her about her grandfather's health." "I will write to her," Anna said. "I can make it both urgent and clear. Her name, Clara Whitfield, care of the Abilene Post Office." Anna wrote the letter that evening at the kitchen table of the ranch house while Emmett reviewed the accounts by lamplight across from her, and the domesticity of the scene was comfortable and natural in a way that felt less like something new beginning than like something long existing being finally recognized. The letter went out on the Friday mail stage. In the meantime, there was a great deal of work to do. The 12 longhorn cattle from outside Amarillo needed to be transported, which required arrangements with the ranch that had been boarding them and the hire of a proper trail man to bring them north. Emmett's cattle operation needed immediate attention on two fronts: the late spring branding of the calves that had arrived since February, and the repair of several outbuildings that had suffered through winter. And the business of the engagement needed to be addressed through the Dust Creek minister, a gentle man named Reverend Aldous Crane, who received the news with visible pleasure, and began discussing the particular flowers that bloomed well in the summer heat. Anna sent a letter to Amarillo as well, to a woman there named Dorothea Strand, who had been her closest friend since childhood, whose husband ran a dry goods operation, and who would want to know, Anna thought, that Anna had apparently lost her considerable mind in the most thoroughly satisfying possible way. Reed Callaway did not disappear from the situation simply because he had been embarrassed at the Tascosa hearing. Men of his type rarely did. 2 weeks after the hearing, he had a conversation in the Dust Creek saloon with Pete Briggs that Pete later described to Emmett and Anna with some delicacy. A conversation in which Callaway had been friendly and expansive, and had offered Pete a position at triple his current wages plus a bonus, contingent only on Pete keeping Callaway informed about the operations at the Thatcher Ranch. Pete had declined. He had done so politely, which was more than Callaway deserved, and he had reported the conversation to Emmett the same evening, which was exactly what Emmett deserved from 11 years of fair treatment and honest wages. "He is getting impatient," Emmett said. "Impatient men make mistakes," Anna said. She was right. 3 days later, a man presented himself at the Harlan County Courthouse with a land deed, a convincingly produced document claiming that Henry Whitfield had sold his 60-acre parcel to the Callaway operation for cash consideration the previous winter. Dorsey at the land office, whatever his personal accommodations with Callaway's interests might be, was not prepared to record a deed transfer on the strength of a document produced by a stranger without the grantor being present to confirm it, and he stalled the process in the way that minor officials sometimes do when they sense that something is going too fast. This gave Anna the 2 days she needed. Clara Whitfield arrived from Abilene on a Tuesday, a composed young woman of 30 who took one look at the deed, listened to her grandfather try to remember what he had or had not agreed to, and stated with considerable force that her grandfather had signed no such thing, and that she would be visiting a lawyer in Tascosa before she went home. The lawyer confirmed that the deed bore Henry Whitfield's signature, but that it had been witnessed by 2 men whose names did not appear in any Harlan County record, which was required by Texas property law for a valid transfer. The deed was fraudulent. The lawyer filed a complaint. This one, unlike Callaway's complaint against Emmett, had the considerable advantage of being true. The effect on Callaway's position in Harlan County was significant. Men who had been friendly with him at the saloon became noticeably less so. Dorsey at the land office, who had clearly been worried about his own future if Callaway's methods came under serious scrutiny, became cooperative with considerable speed. Even the county judge, who owed Callaway various favors he had apparently been regretting for some time, found occasion to be unavailable when Callaway's lawyers came calling. None of this resolved instantly. The legal proceedings involving the fraudulent deed went on for the better part of the summer, but the tide had turned, and everyone in Dusk Creek who paid attention to such things knew it. Anna and Emmett were married on a Saturday in late June, in the yard of the Thatcher Ranch with Reverend Crane officiating, and the summer grass standing tall and the Canadian River shining in the distance. Pete Briggs stood up for Emmett in the plain blue suit he had been married in himself some years prior, and which still fit him adequately enough. Dorothea Strand had come up from Amarillo with her husband, and Clara Whitfield came with old Henry on her arm, and a collection of neighboring ranchers and Dusk Creek townspeople filled out the assembly. Anna wore a dress that she had made herself in the 3 weeks before the wedding, ivory cotton with blue embroidery at the cuffs and collar, practical enough to be comfortable in the June heat, but made with a care and attention to detail that any woman in the assembly would have recognized as love in applied form. She wore her hair up, and she carried a small bunch of whatever flowers happened to be blooming in the field nearest the house, which turned out to be yellow wildflowers whose name she had not thought to look up, and which made a cheerful, informal bouquet that suited her entirely. Emmett stood at the front of the gathering in his good dark coat with his back straight, and his eyes on Anna from the moment she came around the corner of the house, and the expression on his face was private and complete, and so wholly directed at her that Anna felt it like warmth on her skin, even across the 20 feet of summer yard between them. Reverend Crane read the service in his mild and pleasant voice, and when it came to the vows Anna and Emmett spoke them to each other with the kind of directness that was simply how both of them did things, looking at each other steadily in the June sunlight with their hands joined, and the words landing with the full weight they were meant to carry. When it was finished and Reverend Crane had pronounced them married, Emmett kissed her in front of all of them, unhurried and entirely certain, and there was a general sound of approval from the assembled company. Pete Briggs had managed, with unclear assistance, to acquire a case of decent bourbon that appeared during the reception portion of the proceedings, and the afternoon became cheerful in the way that outdoor summer gatherings become cheerful when everyone present is genuinely glad to be there. Dorothea pulled Anna aside near the cottonwood tree by the fence and looked at her for a long moment with the searching attention of a woman who has known someone since they were both 9 years old. "You are happy," she said with an air of faint wonderment. "I am," Anna said. "Not practical happy, actually happy." Anna laughed. "Those are not mutually exclusive." Dorothea looked at Emmett, who was talking with Pete Briggs and Clara Whitfield and her grandfather near the punch table, and then back at Anna. "He is a good man," she said. "I was not sure what I would find when I came up here. I thought you had perhaps been practical in the wrong direction." "Thank you for your confidence," Anna said dryly. Dorothea smiled. "I am giving it now, that is what matters. He is a very good man, and he looks at you like you are the most interesting thing in the county." "I am the most interesting thing in the county," Anna said mildly. Dorothea took her arm and squeezed it. "Yes," she said with complete seriousness. "You are. I am glad he knows it." The summer moved through its long golden arc, and the Thatcher Ranch became something new without ceasing to be what it had been. The 12 Longhorn from Amarillo arrived in July, thin from the road but sound in the leg and good stock, and Anna spent the better part of 3 weeks getting them settled and learning the particular personalities and tendencies of each one, which she annotated in the ranch record book with the same methodical attention she gave to everything she studied. She took on the accounts entirely, Not because Emmett was incapable, but because numbers were a language she was native in and he was not, and the accounts had been in genuine disarray since Grover Sills had run them, and then the period of scrambling after his departure. She spent 2 weeks in August going through 3 years of ledgers with the systematic patience of someone who enjoys finding where errors live. And by the end of it, she had a clear picture of the operation's finances for the first time in years, and a detailed plan for how to use the coming year's cattle sales to clear the remaining tax debt and begin building the reserve. Emmett did not hover over her shoulder while she worked or suggest that she was doing it incorrectly. He brought her coffee at regular intervals and occasionally looked at a specific figure she pointed out and offered an operational explanation for it, and then went back to whatever he was doing. This was exactly the right way to behave, and Anna appreciated it with the particular appreciation of someone who had spent years working in the company of people who were not so sensible. The legal proceedings against Callaway moved slowly, as such things did, but they moved. By September, it was clear that the fraudulent deed would not stand, and that the resulting scrutiny of Callaway's land acquisition methods across the county had surfaced 2 other suspicious transactions that his lawyers were now expending considerable energy managing. He was not ruined. Men of his capital rarely were, but his ability to make life difficult for his neighbors had been substantially curtailed, and the writing of boundary lines had stopped. Henry Whitfield, relieved of the pressure and comforted by his granddaughter's new habit of visiting monthly rather than annually, seemed clearer and more settled than he had been in years. He came to Sunday dinners at the Thatcher Ranch several times through the fall, and he and Emmett talked about the old days and the land with the comfortable ease of men who had been neighbors for a long time and finally had the leisure to be glad about it. Autumn came to the Panhandle in a rush of color and cold, the cottonwoods going yellow along the river, and the first frosts arriving in October with the blunt honesty of that country. No gradual sliding into cold, but a hard shift overnight that left the grass white and crystalline in the mornings. Anna loved the fall light, the long, low slant of it that made the red earth glow, and she was often up before Emmett in the mornings, standing on the porch with her coffee, watching the light come. He found her there one October morning and stood behind her and put his arms around her, and they watched the sunrise together, the sky going from gray to rose to gold, the river catching the light in pieces. He said nothing for a long while, and she leaned back into him and said nothing either, and the silence between them was the kind that does not feel like absence but like presence of the most complete kind. "I want to show you something," he said eventually. He took her on horseback to the northwest corner of the property, where a low ridge ran along the boundary line and gave a view of the Canadian River Valley that Anna had not yet seen from this angle. The valley spread below them in the autumn morning, the river a dark silver thread through the pale gold grass, the sky enormous and perfectly clear, the far horizon a clean line between earth and blue. It was one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. "James and I used to come up here," Emmett said. "When we were boys, we called it the Surveyor's Corner because you could see so much from it." Anna looked at the valley for a long moment. "We should build here someday," she said. "Not move the house, just a place to sit, a bench maybe." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "I like that," he said. She looked at him. "I have something to tell you." His eyes found hers immediately, reading her expression with the attentiveness he had developed for her over these months, that particular quality of focus that was not intrusive but was completely present. "All right," he said. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said. The expression that moved across his face was entirely unguarded, a wave of something so complete and luminous that Anna felt it as a physical thing, warmth moving through the October air between them. "Anna," he said, in that quiet way he had with her name that she had loved since the first time he used it. "The doctor in Dust Creek confirmed it last week. July, he thinks." Emmett reached for her and held her carefully, as though she were simultaneously the most solid and the most fragile thing in the world, and she laughed into his shoulder and told him she was not made of glass and was perfectly capable of sitting a horse and managing accounts until considerably later in the process than he was imagining. He said he knew that. He said it into her hair with a voice that was not entirely steady, and she held him back, and thought that this ridge with this view might be the best place in the entire Panhandle. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was nowhere near as severe as the previous years, which everyone regarded as a direct mercy. The ranch was busy with the quiet indoor work of winter, the repair and preparation that made spring possible, and Anna and Emmett found a rhythm in the long evenings of firelight and books and conversation that felt as though it had been established over years rather than months. He read to her sometimes, from the Marsh essays and from a collection of natural history writings, and from a novel he had ordered from a bookseller in Dallas, that they both found they had strong and partially conflicting opinions about, which produced the most enjoyable arguments Anna had had in years. He was not a man who capitulated in argument to spare her feelings, and she was not a woman who wanted him to, and the negotiations of their intellectual disagreements had a quality of equality and pleasure that was its own form of intimacy. She taught him surveying. This had not been planned. It began one evening when she was updating the ranch boundary maps with the corrections she had been accumulating over the year, and he asked a question about her notation system, and one question led to another, and the next evening she brought out the transit level and showed him how to set it up and use it. He was a quick and careful student, and within 3 weeks he could take basic readings independently, and Anna found herself remembering with a particular happiness the way her father had taught her the same skills, the passing forward of knowledge as a form of love. The spring of 1879 arrived, and with it the business of a new season on the land. The longhorn herd had grown to 23 head with the calves born in the spring, and the combination of Anna's eastern pasture and Emmett's western grass was providing more than enough grazing to support expansion. They hired 2 more cowboys, brothers named Walker from a ranch near Amarillo that was scaling back, quiet, competent men who rode well and worked hard and did not require management beyond a clear task and fair wages. The criminal proceedings against Reed Callaway concluded in April. The fraudulent deed matter resulted in a fine and a formal finding of fraud against the Callaway operation, along with a requirement to restore Henry Whitfield's title in full, which was accomplished under the supervision of a state land commissioner sent down from Austin for the purpose. It was not the most severe outcome that justice might have demanded, but it was real, documented, and public, and Callaway's influence in Harlan County was afterward a diminished thing. He sold 2 of his subsidiary parcels the following year, and was, by all accounts, significantly less interested in the Dust Creek corridor after that. Henry Whitfield, his title secure, lived comfortably for another 3 years, coming to Sunday dinners and talking about the land with the serene confidence of a man who knows his affairs are in order and his granddaughter is nearby. Clara Whitfield met, during one of her monthly visits, one of the Walker brothers, the elder one named Thomas, and after a year of careful and somewhat formal courtship was married to him in the spring of 1880, at which point the Whitfield land had a working rancher on it again for the first time in years, which was good for the land and good for the neighborhood. Anna's child was born in July of 1879, 3 days after the anniversary of her arrival in Dust Creek, which Emmett noted with the wry observation that she had excellent timing in all things. The labor was long but not dangerous, attended by the doctor from Dust Creek and by Dorothea Strand, who had come up from Amarillo specifically for the occasion, and managed the domestic aspects of the situation with the capable calm that had always been her particular gift. The child was a boy, sturdy and dark-haired, with his father's gray-green eyes looking out at the world from the first with an expression of focused interest that both his parents found entirely characteristic. They named him Thomas James Thatcher, Thomas for Anna's father and James for Emmett's brother, and the weight of the names was matched by the weight of the small, warm person who carried them. Emmett held his son for the first time in the morning light of the bedroom, with the July sun coming through the muslin curtains, and the sound of the river in the distance, and Anna watching from the bed, tired and entirely satisfied, and his expression was the same unguarded luminous thing it had been on the ridge in October, that quality of a man whose capacity for feeling turns out to be larger than the careful exterior had ever quite suggested. "Hello, Thomas," he said very quietly to the baby. The baby looked at him with serious gray-green attention. "I have a great deal to show you." Anna laughed softly, and Emmett looked up at her with that expression, and she thought that she had come to this county with a satchel of banknotes and a practical plan, and had acquired instead this particular man, and this particular land, and this particular morning. And the gap between what she had planned and what she had received was so large and so good that the comparison was almost funny. The bench on the ridge at the northwest corner was built that autumn, after the busy season had settled and before the first frosts, by Emmett and Pete Briggs and the Walker brothers over 2 Saturday afternoons. It was a solid bench of seasoned oak with a back of straight-cut timber, and it faced the valley with the pragmatic elegance of something built to last rather than to impress, and it was exactly right. The first evening they sat on it together was a clear September evening with the sky going gold and pink over the valley, Thomas asleep in the crook of Anna's arm. The ranch spread below them with the autumn grass moving in the light, and the river catching the sunset in bright pieces. Pete had ridden back toward the barn, and the 2 Walker boys were somewhere along the south fence, and the evening belonged to the 3 of them entirely. "My father surveyed this valley in 1863, Anna said, looking at the river. "He wrote in his journal that it was some of the finest land he had ever walked. He was right." Emmett looked at the valley for a moment. "He was right that it is fine land," he said. He looked at her, and his voice was quiet and direct in the way she had come to know as the register he used for things that mattered. "But I think the finest thing that came out of that survey was you knowing it well enough to want it." Anna turned her head and looked at him in the gold September light. He was watching her with those gray-green eyes steady and warm and entirely present, the way he had looked at her across the pine table the day he had told her he would rather give her all of it, before either of them had known what all of it actually meant. She reached out with her free hand and found his. He took it. The valley went gold and then rose and then the deep soft purple of dusk, and the river kept its silver thread through all of it, and the 3 of them sat on the bench until the stars came out, one by one and then all at once, the enormous Panhandle sky opening above them with the casual generosity of country that has more room than people have yet learned to fill. Thomas woke briefly and made a small sound of uncertain intention, and Emmett took him with practiced ease and held him up to look at the stars, talking to him quietly in that low, measured voice, explaining what he was seeing with the same seriousness he gave to everything he talked about, and the baby looked at the sky with focused gray-green attention as though considering whether to believe it. Anna watched the 2 of them and felt the fullness of the evening all the way through, not the practical satisfaction of a plan well executed, though that was there too, but the other kind, the kind that does not come from calculation, the kind that comes from standing in the right place at the right time with the right person and knowing it completely. Spring came again the following year with its particular renewal, the Canadian Valley going green along the river first and then gradually outward, the cattle moving through fresh grass, the ranch alive with the productive noise of a working season. The herd had grown to 40 head by then, with plans to expand to 60 by the year after. Anna had developed a reputation in Harlan County and the surrounding area as someone whose survey readings were reliable and whose land knowledge was extensive, and 2 neighboring ranchers had come to her over the winter with surveying questions that she had addressed for a modest fee that went directly into the ranch account. Emmett had completed the addition to the main house that he had been planning since the previous winter. 2 new rooms on the western end that let in the afternoon light, and gave Thomas a proper nursery, and gave Anna a proper office with a north-facing window that was ideal for detailed work. He had built the bookshelves in it himself, straight and solid, and they were already filling with her father's survey volumes and her own notebooks, and the collection of natural history books they had been adding to steadily. One afternoon in late April, Anna was at her desk in the office when she heard horses in the yard and looked out the window to see 3 men she did not recognize dismounting at the fence. She noted the way they moved, the particular alert quality of men who were not sure of their reception, and she went to the kitchen and spoke quietly to Maria, their cook, a capable woman from a family who had worked land in this part of Texas for 2 generations, and told her to let Emmett know there were visitors without anyone making it obvious. She went to the front door herself. The 3 men were trail hands, it turned out, 2 of them brothers named Guthrie from a ranch in New Mexico territory, the third a Texan named Saul who had worked for the Callaway operation until 6 months prior. They had come looking for work. They had heard, through the particular grapevine of the working cattle world, that the Thatcher ranch was honest and expanding. She interviewed all 3 on the porch. Emmett came around from the back of the house midway through, having received Maria's message, and leaned against the porch post and listened while Anna asked careful questions about their experience and their history and their reasons for leaving their previous employment. The Guthrie brothers were straightforward and calm. Saul was more guarded initially, but opened up when Anna asked specific questions about cattle management practices that only someone with genuine experience would have asked. Emmett offered them a trial month at standard wages with the possibility of permanent positions afterward. All 3 accepted. Anna, watching the exchange, thought about how different this felt from the operation she had ridden onto a year and a half ago, short-handed and embattled. The ranch was solid now, and growing, and the security of it was something they had built together in the most literal sense. Saul turned out, over that trial month and beyond it, to be the most valuable hire they had made outside of Pete Briggs. He had a particular gift with young cattle, a patience and attentiveness that settled nervous animals and reduced the stress of branding and moving that could set back a herd's development. He stayed with the Thatcher Ranch for 11 years, and the stories he told the Walker brothers about his Callaway days over evening fires became a kind of local legend. The summer of 1880 was hot and dry, as Panhandle summers were given to being, and Anna and Emmett rode the range together most evenings, checking water sources and rotating the grazing sections with the methodical attention that kept good grass from becoming damaged grass. She was carrying their second child by June, a fact she had told Emmett on the bench at the northwest corner in the May evening, watching the river and holding his hand, and his response had been the same as before, that luminous, unguarded expression, though accompanied this time by Thomas, who was just walking well and was more interested in a beetle he had found on the bench leg than in whatever his parents were doing. The second child arrived in February of 1881, in the middle of a mild winter that felt like a gift after the difficulties of earlier years. It was another boy, which Emmett received with slightly more equanimity than the first time, having practiced the experience of absolute wonder already, and finding it no less absolute the second time. They named him William Keene Thatcher, William for Emmett's father who had broken the first ground of this land, and Keene for Anna's family whose name and knowledge and inheritance had helped to sustain it. By the time William was old enough to walk, Thomas was already following his father around the ranch with the dedicated attention of a child who has decided that whatever his father does is the most important activity occurring anywhere in the world. He had his mother's precise eye and his father's patience, a combination that Pete Briggs observed with considerable satisfaction, was likely to produce someone who would be extremely difficult to argue with when he grew up. The winter evenings in those years had a quality that Anna returned to in memory many times afterward. The house warm with firelight, and the smell of whatever Maria had cooking, and the sound of Emmett reading to the boys, Thomas leaning against his side and William falling asleep against a cushion, the lamp casting its circle of gold over all of them, and the winter dark outside the windows and the land quiet under the stars. She would sit across from them with her account books or her survey notes and look up occasionally at the three of them, and think about the survey maps she had carried into Dusk Creek with a set jaw and a practical plan, and the distance between that day and this one seemed both enormous and entirely logical, the natural result of every choice and circumstance that had led her here. She did not think of it as luck, exactly. She thought of it as the particular result of doing the right things carefully and being open, when it mattered, to something beyond the plan. Clara and Thomas Walker, established on the Whitfield land which Clara had inherited after her grandfather's peaceful death in 1882, became their nearest neighbors and closest friends, sharing the particular bond of people who have helped each other through real difficulties, and come out on the other side with something more solid than the friendship that difficult times can build. The four of them rode together on Sunday afternoons when the weather allowed, the children running ahead through the grass, the adults talking about land and cattle, and the steady business of building things meant to last. Pete Briggs, who had been with the ranch since before Emmett's brother died, married a widow from Dusk Creek named Frances in the spring of 1882. A small ceremony in Reverend Crane's church, attended by the entire Thatcher Ranch household, and featuring a reception supper that Maria had prepared with the cooking ambition of someone who regarded every event as a suitable occasion for her best work. Pete looked at Frances during the whole ceremony with the expression of a man who could not quite believe his good fortune and did not intend to take it for granted. And Anna, watching from the pew beside Emmett, felt Emmett's hand find hers in the quiet of the church. There were difficult seasons, as there always were in that country and that life. A drought year in 1883 that burned the grass brown by July and required moving half the cattle to a borrowed pasture north of the river, and a careful reduction of the herd that was financially painful and practically necessary. A winter in 1885, when a fence line accident put Emmett in bed for 3 weeks with a broken arm and 2 cracked ribs, and he received the forced inactivity with the patience of a man who knew he was not in charge of all outcomes, while Anna managed the full operation with the Walker brothers and Saul and Pete, and carried the additional weight without apparent strain, though she was genuinely tired every evening and slept without moving until dawn. A fever that came through the county in 1884 and took several children in Dusk Creek, which put Anna and Emmett through 10 days of watching Thomas and William with the particular vigilance of fear, before both boys came through without incident, leaving their parents with the particular quiet gratitude of those who have been spared. Through all of it the ranch held and grew, the herd expanding toward the 60 head they had planned and past it, the reputation of the Thatcher operation for quality stock and honest dealing becoming a solid thing in the commerce of the Panhandle. Anna's surveying work had become a recognized practice in its own right by the mid-1880s, her measurements and land reports sought by ranchers and the county alike, her father's instruments and training passed on into a second generation of usefulness that would, she believed, have given him satisfaction. The summer of 1886 brought a visitor neither of them had expected. A man from a land investment company in Dallas, representing a consortium of Eastern capital that was buying up Panhandle ranches ahead of the railroad expansion, arrived at the ranch on a fine afternoon and offered them, across the pine table where Anna had once laid her survey maps and Emmett had once said he would rather give all of it away than half, a price for the property that was considerably more than its market value. Anna and Emmett heard the offer through to its end. They served coffee, as had become the custom of that table, and they listened carefully and without visible reaction, which the man from Dallas probably took for deliberation. When he had finished, Anna and Emmett looked at each other across the table in the way they had developed over 8 years of working and living on this land together, a look that communicated in a single exchange the full consideration of the matter. "No," Anna said pleasantly to the man from Dallas, "but thank you for coming." He was somewhat surprised and spent another quarter-hour presenting the merits of the offer from several additional angles, at which point Emmett, who had been quiet and politely attentive throughout, said in his level way that they had given him their answer and they were not reconsidering it, and the man from Dallas departed. They sat on the porch afterward in the late afternoon sun and listened to Thomas and William chasing each other around the cottonwood at the fence with the purposeless energy of healthy boys, and watched the light come long and golden across the grass and the river shining to the north. "He will come back," Emmett said mildly. "He will," Anna agreed. "Or someone else will. And the answer will be the same." She looked at the land, the full sweep of it, the eastern parcel she had come to buy, and the western pasture she had married into, and everything between. 8 years of work and knowledge and life laid into the soil of it. Her father's surveys in the record books and her own surveys alongside them. The herd that had started as 12 thin longhorn and was now 100 head of quality stock. The ranch house with its new rooms and its full bookshelves. The bench on the northwest ridge that faced the valley. "Yes," she said, "the answer will be the same." They sat for a while longer as the afternoon moved toward evening, and Thomas and William came up onto the porch and collapsed in the breathless, boneless way of children who have exhausted themselves thoroughly, and Emmett pulled William onto his lap, and the boy went immediately to the focused quiet that preceded sleep, and Thomas sat beside Anna and leaned into her side and asked what they were looking at. "The ranch," Anna said. "What about it?" She looked at the land for a moment, at the grass and the sky and the river, and all the particular things that 8 years of careful attention had taught her to read in it. "Just that it is ours," she said. "All of it." Thomas considered this with the serious attention of an 8-year-old who had been raised to think carefully about things. "Pete says it was almost not," he said. "Pete is right," Emmett said from across the bench. "It almost was not. What saved it?" Emmett and Anna looked at each other over the heads of their boys. Across the bench on the porch of the ranch house that sat on land that both of them had fought for and worked for and built lives on. In the particular evening light of the Panhandle that made everything look as though it had been lit from somewhere lower and warmer than the sky. His gray-green eyes were steady and warm and entirely present, as they had always been, as she believed they would always be. "Your mother rode out here with a satchel full of maps and a practical plan," Emmett said, the faint smile she loved moving across his face. "And neither of us ended up where we planned." Thomas absorbed this. "Is that good?" "It is the best thing that ever happened to me," Emmett said simply, still looking at Anna. Anna felt the warmth of it, as she had felt it on that Tascosa afternoon outside the courthouse, as she had felt it on the northwest ridge in October with the stars coming out, as she felt it every morning she woke on this land with this man beside her, and every evening she watched the sun go down over the Canadian Valley from the bench they had built together to look at it from. "Yes," she said, "it is." The evening came on slowly, the way it did in that country, the sky going through its long, unhurried progression of color, and the ranch settled into the quiet of nightfall with the horses in the barn and the hands at their supper, and the coyotes beginning somewhere along the river. William was fully asleep in Emmett's arms. Thomas had tipped sideways against Anna's shoulder with the peremptory unconsciousness of the very young. The lamp in the kitchen window made a warm square of light in the gathering dark, and the stars were beginning to appear, first in the east and then everywhere, the enormous Panhandle sky opening into its full night extravagance of light. Anna Keene Thatcher sat on the porch of the ranch that was entirely hers and entirely his, and looked at the land that she knew in every detail and loved in every season, and thought that her father, riding this valley with his transit level in 1863, could not have known that he was mapping the ground where his daughter would build the best years of her life. But he had taught her to read it, and that was the same thing in the end. Emmett caught her eye in the lamplight and smiled at her, that warm, unhurried smile that had been changing the quality of the air around her since the first time it appeared, and she smiled back, and between them the boys slept the deep sleep of children who are entirely safe, and the ranch held its ground in the dark, and the Canadian River went on in its silver way through the grass, and everything that mattered was exactly where it belonged.